Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So again, those of you who have been following my channel recently will know that I've been reviewing a whole bunch of 6th generation titles, many of which I played for the first time ever. In my last video, I looked at Scarface The World Is Yours, which is of course a movie tie-in. Today we're going to be looking at another movie license game, Van Helsing, released in 2004, developed by Sapphire. So Van Helsing was a movie that came out back in 2004. Published by Universal, starring Hugh Jackman, who was kind of at the peak of his popularity at the time, playing Wolverine in the X-Men movies, which themselves got a bit of a mixed reception back then. Essentially, the movie was about a monster hunter working for the Vatican, travelling the world and eliminating demonic threats, keeping the general public safe from things that go bump in the night. Long story short, one thing leads to another, and Van Helsing gets sent to Transylvania to hunt down and destroy the vampire Count Dracula. It's a movie that basically got tore apart critically, and it failed to start a franchise. Me personally, I actually really enjoyed the movie as a kid, and I still have it on DVD. It's not a great movie or anything like that, but I do think it's a little bit underrated. It's kind of a fun popcorn movie if nothing else, but I digress. Back in that era, movie license games of this kind were very common. Pretty much every major release had its own tie-in game released alongside it, and as I've talked about on this channel many times before, these tie-in games had a very negative reputation. This is of course due to the fact that they generally had shorter development cycles than most games, and were mostly considered cash grabs, trying to capitalise on the movie's popularity. And for the most part that was the case. However, again, as I've discussed many times on this channel before, I actually have a bit of a soft spot for movie license games, since there are actually quite a few of them that I really enjoy. In fact, back when I made my top 100 favourite video games list a while back, link in description, I made it clear that quite a few movie tie-ins are on that list. And every now and then you would come across a game that bucked the trend and turned out to be a pleasant surprise. Was Van Helsing one of those games, or was it just another mediocre cash grab? I would say to some extent it's a little bit of both, but I'll get to that later. Before I go any further, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button since it really helps me in the algorithm, and feel free to subscribe to the channel if you're new. Let's get started with the review. First of all, a bit about my own history with the game. So I first played this game back in 2010 if I remember rightly, at a friend's house, and I can vaguely remember playing through the game and having fun with it, but we didn't complete it. Up until very recently I never actually owned the game myself. I recently bought the game in a second-hand store and completed it for the first time. The game is a third-person action-adventure beat-em-up set during the events of the movie. As far as the overall story goes, it follows the movie's plot very loosely. Just like in the movie, it begins in Paris, where Van Helsing is hunting down the villainous Mr. Hyde.
Bonjour, monsieur. Welcome to Paris.
Show yourself, Dr. Jekyll.
Seems that memory of yours is getting worse, Van Helsing. The name is Hyde, remember?
Here you get a useful tutorial that helps to familiarise you with the game's overall combat, controls and gameplay, as well as the platforming mechanics. You get a short, easy boss fight against Mr. Hyde, which basically serves as a combat tutorial, teaching you the basics. What you'll notice about the game is it bears a strong resemblance to many classic hack and slash games from the past, such as Devil May Cry and several others. You have several ways to approach combat, as well as several different weapons and items to unlock and use throughout. The vast majority of the game consists of combat, and what I would consider to be light platforming. Van Helsing will need to traverse across various areas of Transylvania, wiping out hordes of demonic enemies, and working his way towards Dracula's lair. Along the way you come across various characters from the movie, such as Anna Valerius. She's basically the love interest in the movie. She doesn't play as much of a predominant role here though. She basically just shows up in cutscenes from time to time, and even these are few and far between. You also come across the Frankenstein monster here and there. There are also various characters from the movie who are strangely absent from the game. For example, Carl the Friar, who was David Wenham's character from the movie. He was kind of the comic relief. He wasn't in the game at all, and I don't think he was ever mentioned. There are even characters who are more prominent here, such as the ghost of Valerius the Eldar, who shows up from time to time to guide you through the game. Each level begins with a mission briefing from the contact at the Vatican as he introduces you to the level's objective. You enter an area, which is mostly linear, though there is a bit of backtracking here and there, and a little bit of exploration, and you fight your way past hordes of enemies. What actually did surprise me about the game is that it has a surprising amount of depth in regards to its combat, at least for a rushed movie tie-in. There is actually quite a bit of weapon and enemy variety, and for the most part I had fun with it. As far as the combat goes, you have both melee attacks and ranged attacks, and this gets more and more complex as the game goes on. You start the game off with Van Helsing's Tojo blades for melee attacks, and his dual pistols for ranged attacks. These are the revolvers seen in the movie. And as the game progresses, you unlock more powerful and effective weapons. For example, late in the game you unlock scimitars, which are significantly more effective melee weapons. As far as guns go, there are actually quite a few of them in the game. In addition to Van Helsing's pistols, you can also unlock a badass shotgun, which is more useful against bosses and tougher enemies. It's also way more effective from close range. I found myself relying on the shotgun for most of the game if truth be told, but I digress. You also have the rapid fire crossbow from the movie, which is far more effective from long range, and is great for defeating swarms of flying enemies. More on those later. You also get an electro tool which fires large powerful electric blasts. Very late on in the game you even unlock the Gatling gun. You might remember this gun made an appearance in the movie early on, but was never used for some reason. Suffice it to say, once you unlock the Gatling gun, the game becomes incredibly easy, since you can basically cheese your way through enemies, and it makes you practically unstoppable, but I digress. In addition to unlocking weapons, you can also unlock upgrades for each weapon. Each melee weapon will have an alternative attack that will need to be charged up that does significantly more damage to enemies. For example, the scimitars can produce flames that make your attacks more powerful. The guns will also have their own alternative ammo, such as explosive shells in your shotgun, or explosive bolts in your crossbow. The electro tool will even have an energy beam that can activate certain switches to help you obtain collectibles. I mentioned before that the game has plenty of enemy variety. Some of the enemies are from the movie, others are new, added for the sake of content. As you play through the game, you come across various generic enemy types, all of which feel very different from one another, and will attack you in different ways. Some enemies will even be more resistant, and in some cases even immune to some of your ranged attacks. And the overall design of the enemies is quite creepy, and fits the overall tone of the game. For example, you take on possessed skeletons, who are the standard weaker enemies of the game. As the game progresses, you take on tougher and more dangerous enemies, such as stone gargoyles of various kinds. These come in different shapes and sizes, some of which will attack you from the air. You have several other flying enemies, such as Dracula's vampire bat offspring, flying skulls, and several others. You have these flying banshee type enemies. You take on giant statues. You also have the Dwergi, who are Dracula's minions from the movie. These are quite annoying since some of them are armoured and they often attack you in large groups and can swarm your position. You also take on mini werewolves for some reason, which I found quite interesting, and several other demonic threats throughout the game, some of which are larger and more durable than others. Point is, the game has plenty of enemy variety throughout, and the large selection of weapons and the few upgrades you can get help to keep the game feeling fresh and a little bit less repetitive. In addition to combat, the game, as I mentioned before, also has plenty of platforming. Most of the game's levels will require you to jump and climb through them, and the platforming, while very simple, at least does its bit to add some variety to the game. You also get a grapple hook, kinda like Batman, which can be used to grapple up to high areas, and even swing across various ledges. This is very fun actually. One issue with this that makes the game a bit frustrating is the camera. The game's camera is pretty bad for an action-adventure beat-em-up. It has the same problem that the Eragon game had, in the sense that the game's camera just doesn't seem fit for purpose, and it takes a bit of getting used to. For example, it appears to have a fixed camera that often doesn't sync up to the controls, and this can cause a lot of confusing moments during gameplay, sometimes during combat, but particularly during platforming sections. For example, the game will change camera angle and the controls will take a while to sync up to it. It can cause you to take unnecessary damage and can cause you to fall and have to repeat a platforming section. It's just one of them nitpicks about the game that I found quite annoying. Aside from the combat and platforming, another aspect of the game is the collectibles. This game, to its credit, actually has quite a few collectibles to find, as well as a few bonus features. This of course gives you an incentive to explore the levels as much as possible, to try to find everything the game has to offer. For example, there are these items called life increasers that can be used to increase your maximum health. Basically, finding 2 life increasers adds another section to your health bar. For obvious reasons, on higher difficulties this is very useful. You're going to want to search every nook and cranny in the levels to find as many of these as you can. Most of them are relatively easy to find, although some of them can take a bit of searching, so I would advise looking out for them. You can also find items called life replenishers, which can refill your health bar entirely. This can help you get out of a tight spot, particularly during boss battles. You can also find speed boosts, which of course make your attacks faster, very useful in combat for obvious reasons. And you can also find ammo replenishers. These refill your alternative ammo attacks for your weapons, again very useful for obvious reasons. In addition to finding these items in levels, you can also purchase them from the armory at the end of each level. Completing a level gives you access to the armory, and this gives you an opportunity to not only buy some of these items rather than finding them yourself during levels, but also you can buy some upgrades for your weapons that I mentioned earlier, as well as some useful new combat moves. By defeating enemies and breaking objects in the environment, you can collect these little green crosses. These act as currency that can be spent in the game's armory. Be sure to collect as many of these as you need. You can actually return to areas to farm these by making enemies respawn and defeating them for currency. I would recommend doing this, since it can really help you to unlock all the upgrades as early as possible, as well as to purchase items when you need them. Some of the collectibles in the game will also be locked off to you on a first playthrough, since some of them require a particular weapon or upgrade to access. For example, you might need the Gatling gun to open a door, or the explosive shotgun to open a door, or the electro tool upgrade to access a switch. There's lots of examples of this. This adds to the game's replay value, of course, with a welcome New Game Plus mode. I'll talk a bit about that later. In addition to these collectibles, the game also has many bonus items. These are known as cheat glyphs. These can be used to unlock bonus gameplay features. For example, you can change the appearance of certain enemy types. You can also unlock various alternative skins for Van Helsing, such as giving him a big head, or even making him a shadowy figure, or making him translucent. Some of these look really cool, and I appreciate these features. In addition to these features, the game also has several bonus challenge missions. Each of these will unlock a cheat glyph of their own. To access the challenge missions, you must first find Easter eggs hidden around the game. Most of these are relatively easy to find if you look for them, and these will be needed to unlock every challenge mission. If truth be told, I didn't like these challenge missions. They aren't really that fun if truth be told, and they feel like a bit of an unnecessary difficulty spike to me, but I digress. If you want to 100% the game, you'll have to do them. And I suppose if nothing else, they do their bit to add variety to the game, as well as some replay value. Speaking of replay value, as I mentioned before, the game also has a New Game Plus mode, where you can basically restart the game with all your weapons and upgrades. This gives you a great incentive to go back and pick up all the collectibles that you may have missed the first time. So yes, you can play through the entire game with the Gatling gun, and yes, it makes the game extremely easy. You can basically blast your way through enemies and bosses with ease. I really appreciate this feature, since it can be fun to replay the game with all your weapons and feel like a badass. It makes the game into a bit of a power fantasy. Plus, as I mentioned before, you'll need to do this to acquire all the collectibles and complete the game 100%. You might have noticed that I haven't mentioned the boss battles yet. I wanted to dedicate a whole section of the review to this, because as limited and somewhat generic as the game is, I do think it really shines with its boss battles. There are actually quite a few of them in the game. Some of them are actually quite epic. For example, you take on several enemies from the movie, such as the Frankenstein monster who you fight twice, Velkin the werewolf who you fight several times, and you also fight the vampire brides of Dracula one at a time. You even fight Dracula himself, including his demon form. Another boss is Igor, who was kind of Dracula's assistant in the movie. In this game he's like a super powerful sorcerer or something, and he's actually one of the most challenging bosses in the game, or at least he was for me.
The master will be most pleased to have his revenge, but not before I have my fun.
When facing the bosses, you can usually rely on dodge rolls to avoid most of their powerful attacks, as well as jumps and lateral movement, and spam ranged attacks at them, using melee attacks to hit and run strategically. As I mentioned before, the shotgun is quite effective against bosses, particularly the werewolf for some reason. I really enjoyed the boss battles, and they did their bit to add some variety to the game. One thing that disappointed me, however, was the fact that you don't get to play as the werewolf Van Helsing.
Please, God, forgive me. You have been forgiven.
In the movie, Van Helsing turns into a werewolf and has an epic fight scene with Dracula. I was really looking forward to that happening in the game, for an epic final boss battle. But unfortunately it only happens in a cutscene, so you don't get to play that version of Van Helsing. Such a wasted opportunity. But I get it was probably due to time restraints and short development cycle. It sucks that they never added the feature, but I digress. I think the main problem with the game, however, is the length. The game is incredibly short and could probably be completed in a few hours if you're good at it. The game just feels incredibly rushed to me, particularly its ending, which is so anticlimactic and seems to come out of nowhere. This is a common issue with movie license games. It's like they need to release as soon as possible to meet a deadline, and don't bother to include a satisfying ending. Again, it's not too bad here, since the game does have a New Game Plus mode, bonus features and some replay value. But again, it could have been so much cooler, with a more satisfying and climactic ending. I still had fun with the game for what it's worth. The level and location variety is okay for the most part, the graphics and presentation are pretty good for 2004. The character models look great, and the levels themselves look awesome from the most part. And as I mentioned before, the combat is fun and competent, if a bit simplistic. And the game has some epic boss battles. Unfortunately, the game is severely let down by its short length, and lack of a satisfying ending. And the truth be told, it doesn't really have much to offer that you couldn't honestly get from some of the more established hack and slash games in the genre. For a movie license game though, it does the job well, and it serves its purpose well enough. I give the game a solid and well deserved 6 out of 10. I actually enjoyed it a little bit more than the Scarface game, since despite being more simplistic, it was a bit more fun for me. Thanks for watching guys, I really enjoyed playing and reviewing Van Helsing. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new, since it really helps me out. And stay tuned for more content. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.